there's terrible tragedies that can happen to any one of us. You get hit with two or three at the same time, that can just knock you out. You
Oh
lose your
yeah.
job, you get cancer, and death in the family. Boom, boom, boom. You're you're not having a good time, not at all. And you wake up in the morning, you're like, why bother? Christ is there to say you're still worth something.
What do you think the early church was like, and what appeals to you about it? And is it any different than the modern church?
Yeah, the first century church, right? You know,
Hmm.
because after Christ passed, Christ died. Um, we all switched to AD. So we're in the year 2022 AD right now. Um, so the first century uh, Christian kingdom, was, I mean, under severe threat from the the leaders of the time, and even just the culture of the time. Maybe that's one of the ways we're the same. That never really changes, because you're always under attack. Oh, sorry, fly. You're the Christ life is always under attack from people who don't understand, or the whims of culture, so to speak. One of the things the Christian church did, in the early days, was, they were people who actually lived, who knew Christ personally. It wasn't just stories that they read or writ down. In fact, most of the people at that time were, illiterate, and it was very difficult to actually transmit things in writing, because you had to know someone who could read and write it down, put it on horseback and ride it, across the continent, and hope that they're not, uh, killed, or taken captive by murderers and people along the road who would do that sort of thing, barbarians. And so a lot of the way the message, the gospel, was spread was through word of mouth. It was through these missions, these people, like Paul or Peter, for example, going from city to city and town to town. And they would write letters to people, of course. But it spread very quickly. I believe Paul did a lot of work in the Roman Empire, sort of the Mediterranean area, and Peter actually went eastward, and so he went to Indonesia area. I think I got that right. Christianity took a little while to become popular. I guess you could say. It eventually did become the primary religion. That's why we have Roman Catholics, right? Like that's where that comes from. Is the Roman Empire eventually, you know, incorporated it into their DNA of their culture. And so, what's really interesting about that, to me, is sort of the grassroots aspect of it. And I think it's something we take for granted in the modern church, about like what things people know and or don't know about the Bible, or about the message of Christ, because we've lived in the Western Christian culture, or at least the derivative of that culture, for quite a while now.
Yeah, that's interesting. You think they had a perspective that maybe we don't have, that we could benefit from recovering almost?
Part of modern life, right, is that we have a lot of modern conveniences. We have a lot of buffers between us and the natural world. Um, like, I don't have to work on a farm to get my food, and I'm very thankful for that. I get to do computer programming, right? Like, I'm very, very thankful for that. But there's a disconnect in some sense between me and my neighbor, right? Because I'm not doing something that directly affects them, even though we live right next to each other in a town. Way back when, if you lived in a town, you supported your town and your neighbor and your country, because who else is going to help you in your time of need? Like, nobody knows about you except for your neighbor. And so, what's interesting to me about that is these early Christians had everything to lose following Christ. you don't break the culture. You don't try to introduce something that's going to throw a wrench in the works, because you're going to get thrown out of your town. You're going to you're going to get cast away. And yet, what they saw, what they understood of the Christ life, was so profound to them and so total that they said, you know what? It's more important that I share this with people and risk them not accepting it, and risk that I may be a vagabond, traveling around, than to not speak up or to disregard it. And so I think there's a risk factor that's it hasn't gone away, but it's definitely been lighter.
Hmm.
It's easier these days for people to enter the church, easier than it's ever been. Um, but I think what that causes, though, is this confusion that it's easy to be a Christian. And I think you see, you're nodding your head. I think you see
Yep.
where I'm going with this.
Oh yeah.
Um, there's I forget who said it. Some Christian writer, but they were talking about what it feels like, or some sort of little analogy for what it's like to follow Christ. And they were saying that it costs you everything, and it really does, because you're giving your whole being into what this path is. And so there's a little bit of a false sense of ease, I think, in certain churches about what it means to follow Christ. And some people find out the hard way, probably for the best, ironically enough. They give themselves to Christ and then really find out what's all involved with that. And not to say that the sacrifice isn't worth it, but just that it is a sacrifice. And you lose people, family and friends, and you're misunderstood by people often, um, when you are in the pursuit of truth, because that's what Christ is he's the word, he's the truth. And to pursue that means you're going to learn some stuff that you didn't expect, and
Hmm.
that's hard to share with people because they may just not understand.
Well, yeah, I can relate to what you're saying because there's things that I deal with, that maybe I don't want to deal with. And like we can't necessarily ignore some of our inner demons as much as a Christian as maybe we did
Mm,
before. Like, I guess we have to make the difficult decision to look inward and address some of our own issues, like
mhm,
that is hard and that's kind of painful. But I think if I look at myself in 10-year chunks, it's definitely been a good thing. But it's not ever easy to confront your own problems or
mhm.
maybe unhealthy coping mechanisms or whatever it is.
What what was the name? This is a very famous story in the Bible, and I'm a little embarrassed. I don't remember the name of the person, but he becomes Israel. His name, your name shall be Israel, and he's the one who has the wrestling match with
Jacob.
Jacob. Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, Something interesting about that story, right? It's a very odd story, and one of the lessons that it teaches, I think, is that part of having a relationship with the transcendent, with the divine, is a struggle. It's a fight, because one, Christ is everything. Christ is everything. And when you bring yourself up against that, you bring with you all of your inadequacies and all of your sin and all of your problems, all of your good as well. But you bring that up against Christ and it just gets dashed to pieces. And you got to pick yourself back up, and you're a little bit lighter now because you've thrown off some of the things that have held you back before. But if you still want to pursue Christ, you have to put yourself up against him again.
Mm-hmm.
And it's intimidating to do that over and over again, because in some ways it's a fight you're going to lose, but it's also the way that you move forward in life. And I don't just mean spiritually. I mean that's what you do in a career. That's what you do for personal development. Every time I go to the gym, right, I'm pushing myself to my limit, and then I try to go a little further, and I break myself down a little bit. It's painful,
It's
but you get
funny you say
stronger
that
through that.
because that's exactly what I was thinking. I was thinking about cross country when I used to
Yeah,
run in high school, and they'd be
we
like,
were on the same
"Oh,
cross, not at
yeah,
the same time, but we
not at
were
the
in
same
cross
time.
country
Yeah, same
together. Yeah,
school." Yeah, because I was thinking, I remember when my coach started introducing longer and longer workouts, and it's like, today we're going to run 13 miles. And I'm like, oh, no. And, I guess it was good for you, but it also breaks you down at the
yeah.
same time. Yeah, that's the analogy that came to mind for me.
That's the thing that I think is missing from a lot of the Christian message in most churches these days. Is just because you become a Christian doesn't mean you're immune from suffering or tragedy. Um,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Sorry, Joel Osteen, but
And I think that's right. And I think a lot of people probably would never become a Christian then, because they're like, well, screw that. I'm not gonna be part of this organization if I'm not going to get anything out of it. That's a very transactional way of thinking about it.
Mhm.
And in some sense, they're right. Like if you don't get something out of putting effort towards it, then maybe it's not worth your time. But what you stand to gain from this doesn't work that way. It's here's another way of thinking about it, right? There's terrible tragedies that can happen to any one of us. You get hit with two or three at the same time, that can just knock you out. You
Oh,
lose your
yeah.
job, you get cancer, and death in the family. Boom, boom, boom. You're you're not having a good time, not at all. And you wake up in the morning, you're like, why bother? Christ is there to say, you're still worth something. You're still meaningful. Your life is still meaningful and has purpose. And despite this suffering, you have the strength to stand against it. What an encouraging message, right? And like, how else are you going to combat the tragedies of the world? Like, you need something to stir your spirit, to get you up. And I
Mhm.
love that. I love that about it. And that's definitely what the first century church had, right? They had a mission, man. They were like, this message is bigger than any one of us, and we got to share this as best as we can. And you know what? Some people aren't going to accept it, and that's okay. Maybe they will in time, maybe not. But I know what my purpose is and my
Mhm.
mission, and I'm going to keep moving and do that.
It's somewhat embarrassing for me to say, but so 10 years ago, I wasn't nearly as far in my studying and my walk and my journey in my faith. And I remember at that time, some friends, some college friends asked me about Christianity and like what it was and why I thought it was relevant or meaningful. Well, my answer was, I think it's the best way to live. And I suppose that's still true, but not in the way that I thought it was at the time. Like, I don't know that it's the most enjoyable way to live all the time. I can say it's the most meaningful. Maybe I could say that,
Yeah.
but like, I feel like I sold it way short. I think of it more as like God's trying to create a family and he loves people. He's trying to ask all of them to join it or to come back to it. And I was thinking more about like how is my life going to be if I do things right, you
Hmm.
know? And there's a much bigger message there that I just hadn't come to that understanding yet. But what you said earlier, that almost like a I don't know if it's an infant level or a teenager level of explanation of the story of what Christianity is widely circulating. And of course, you've got people around that are in all different stages in their faith journey, so maybe that's why. But
Mhm.
at some point, we've all got to graduate to this level of understanding, like, oh, like, yeah, Christianity is really meaningful and powerful, but it's not like you become a Christian and you're not going to get cancer. Like, your life is going to be tough, but it will have meaning.
It'll have meaning, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean that's the trade-off, right? Is you you know there's all sorts of philosophies and religions in the world that try to offer meaning, and what we're saying is we believe this is the best one that does that, and also the one that is true, and true not just in a meaning sense. There's a famous conversation between C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. So Lewis wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, and Tolkien, of course, wrote Lord of the Rings. Both very influential, very amazing stories. And at the time, C.S. Lewis was a Christian, and I believe Tolkien was an agnostic. And they're both very, very well read gentlemen. They're both very educated, and they've read very famous historical myths. And Tolkien asked Lewis, he called him Jack. His nickname was Jack. He's like, Jack, why do you, why are you a Christian now? Because he didn't used to be. And he says, well, Christianity, the story of Christ, is a true myth. And that's what's so powerful about it, is it's not only mythological in the sense that it's this story that has survived, endured the span of time, right? You know, it's true in that it actually happened. And so there's a marriage in the story, not of the divine and the earthly. And that's what's so cool about it, is the structure of it is that marriage, just like the content of it is that marriage. And Tolkien was so moved by that. He eventually converted to Christianity as well. That made sense to him, and I just thought that was very interesting.
Wow. So that conversation is responsible for us getting Lord of the Rings, huh?
Maybe, maybe. I love Lord of the Rings so much, so much. Also has a very good mythological origin story. There's the four main books: The Hobbit, The Fellowship, The Two Towers, and then Return of the King. But after Tolkien died, his son put together a bunch of his work that hadn't been published, and they published a book called the Silmarillion. And it's really dense. It's really hard to read, if I'm honest. Um, but it gives context to the world of the Lord of the Rings. And one of the stories in that is the origin story of Middle Earth. And this may be a good tie into kind of some of the next questions that we'll get to. In that origin story, there's God with a big G. I think his name's Eru, and then there's like the gods with a little G kind of thing, and they create the world through music and song. There's something I really like about that. We're both musicians, we both recognize sort of the patterns of music, and how there's horizontal patterns across time and vertical patterns like melodies and structure like that, and how you can have patterns that come together on multiple levels and fit together, and that can make really powerful and beautiful music. And that's how they created the world. But then evil comes into the world, kind of thing. And what does that look like in his myth? Well, it's discord, it's disharmony. It's people, it's the entities who are part of this chorus saying, I don't want to play a part in this song. I have my own song I want to sing. And so they start singing their own thing that's, conflicting with the goings on of the actual song. And that's how that's introduced into the world.
That is almost like early Genesis. That is
Right?
basically just a retelling of Genesis 3.
Hmm.
Well, actually, you could say it's Genesis 1 through 11.